Welcome to Cultimatum, the podcast that delves deep into the culture of complexities of cults and human trafficking. I'm your host, Anonymous Andrew. Each week, we explore different facets of cult life and human trafficking, from the psychological manipulation to the brave stories of those who have escaped.
Hello, everyone. I'm Melody. I'm Andrew's co-host. Having experienced the depth of a cult firsthand, specifically the House of Yahweh, I'm here as an advocate for fellow survivors. My journey has inspired me to help others who find themselves in similar situations. This podcast is committed to respecting our guests' privacy. To ensure their comfort and safety, we offer them the option to remain anonymous.
Additionally, we would like to include a disclaimer. The views and opinions expressed by our hosts and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of Cultimatum or its affiliates. Cultimatum is not responsible and does not verify for accuracy any of the information shared by our hosts and guests. The content discussed on this podcast is based on personal experiences, opinions, and speculation, and should not be construed as professional services or advice. Neither the host nor the guest are assuming liability for any misuse or reliance on the information presented. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and listeners are encouraged to conduct their own research and seek professional advice where appropriate.
Before we dive into today's episode, we want to issue a trigger warning. Some episodes may explore explicit and potentially disturbing topics such as sexual abuse, rape, human trafficking, suicide, and other sensitive subjects. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to Cultimatum Podcast, the culture of cult and human trafficking. And today we have a very, very special episode. Melody, would you like to introduce our guest today?
Oh, I would love to. We have got a treat for our audience today. We have got Carol Mercantile with us, and she is with the McAllister and Oliveris law firm, and she is an expert in cult law. Carol, welcome to the show. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely, our pleasure. And this is something that we've been looking forward to since we started the podcast. Melody, where would you like to start?
I'm going to say, Carol, how about you start with telling us how you got involved in representing victims of cults? And was there a particular case, or how did you get involved in this? Or are you a cult survivor yourself? Where did that start for you?
It all started for me, and no, I'm not a cult survivor. I was a lawyer, am a lawyer, but I was retired, and I in 2018, about the time of Harvey Weinstein, if you can think back to that.
Yeah.
Yes. And so at that time, I ran across some information about a woman who was having conducting a project. She called it Buddhist Project Sunshine. And it was based on the fact that she felt that there had been a lot of sexual abuse in the Buddhist organization that she was involved in, which was headquartered in Halifax in Canada. And so have you ever had these moments when you think back and you think, like, in a split second, I made a decision that changed at least the next 6 years of my life? Because I was talking with her and I said, you need to ask the organization to do an investigation of this. And I said that because I had been an employment lawyer and I had done many, many investigations in corporate America. And of course, when someone made a claim that there was sexual misconduct in the workplace, you would do an investigation and try to find out what the heck happened. And I said to her, that's what you need to do. And she said, well, they won't do it. They're not even speaking to me. And in that split second, I thought, well, here I am. I'm a lawyer. I've done investigations. I honestly did not think that was happening. And so I thought, I'll help her out. And that began what was for me a kind of a 4-year pro bono project of investigating sexual abuse in what I thought of then as spiritual communities, Buddhist and yoga. But what I came to learn were cults, or at least cult like organizations, high demand, coercion, all of those kinds of things. So I did that for 4 years, and what I found out was um, that I really wasn't having any success in getting organizations to address the issues or to change. And I felt like I needed the kind of what I think of as the hammer of the law. That's the kind of where you go when nothing else works. And so I met Anne Oliverius, who's the partner in the law firm McAllister Oliverius. And I saw that she was a fighter. She'd long been a fighter for women's rights. And I asked her if she would be interested in taking any of these cases. And she agreed to. And eventually I came on staff. And so I now head up a group of lawyers, all of whom are involved in litigating on behalf of survivors of cults and spiritual communities where there's been sexual abuse. That's a long way around that that question, Melody. But there you are. That it was there. I was there, and it was just an opportunity for me to take on something that's wrong. It's just completely wrong.
100%. On behalf of cult survivors, we so appreciate your efforts and your donating of your time and your efforts, because it's very hard sometimes to get even people to recognize that it's abuse, let alone represent victims. That's amazing.
Yes, thank you for that. And I will say that, yes, I share that view that it is very hard for people to wrap their minds around this. There are lots of stereotypes about cult survivors, or that people who get drawn into these things, that they are, it's the kind of, I would never do that. That would never happen to me. That's kind of the response I think that many people have, but it's not true.
No.
In fact, it could happen to any of us. Often it happens to people. I know I'm preaching to the choir here because all of this. It happens to people who are in a vulnerable position. It happens to young people who haven't experienced agency in their lives yet. It happens to people who are seeking, who've been abused in other situations. And it is a tremendous betrayal of trust. And we need so many changes in the legal system in order to be able to bring some kind of justice to survivors.
Oh, for sure.
All right, Carol, I have a big question here that will open up maybe the rest of the episode. I'd like to give you an example. You may or may not know of the cult La Luz del Mundo, the Iglesia La Luz del Mundo, they're based in Mexico and Texas. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And we had Judith Castillo on, who is now a huge advocate, and she got out. She was married to the grandson of one of the apostles, who is now doing 15 years for minor child sexual abuse.
Yes.
Why? And then we could cite all the other ones, like Nexium, and of course, now we have P. Diddy, which is really more human trafficking, but we do cover human trafficking as well. And P. Diddy is now in custody. But let's go back to the cult. So La Luz del Mundo, and off the top of my head, I don't have let's talk about the Twin Flames universe. The documentary that I watched, which was on Amazon and Netflix, two separate documentaries. There was a woman from, I think it was Vanity Fair, a journalist, went there and spent a week there with them, and they videoed the whole thing. And while one of the episodes showed, and I remember seeing this in the episode, the police came, knocked on the door, and they had some questions. There were allegations of child and adult forced labor, so you had to work for free. There were allegations of sexual abuse. There were several people who had committed suicide because they just didn't know how to, whatever, yada, yada, yada. And the police were asking them about these issues. And in my opinion, because I'm an expert in gaslighting, because on my other podcast, I do subjects as gaslight. They gaslit the detectives,
Yes.
and walked out and said, "Thank you for your time." And then I never heard anything else from it, as if. So why? Law enforcement seems to have a problem going after these organizations. The Luz del Mundo, if they put the apostle in jail, why don't they say this organization is corrupt and disgusting and
do something?
Yeah, do something.
Yes.
Because it's not just that one apostle. There's multiple. How come we can't go after these cults legally?
It's very complicated. So let me give you one, just one issue. One issue is that they are often masked as religious organizations. And once you put on the cloak of being a religious organization, then there's a lot of, hands off kinds of things that happen. So we have the First Amendment in the United States. We have freedom of religion, which means that you are free and I am free to worship as we choose. It does not mean that organizations that cloak themselves in the garb of being religious are allowed to break the law. However, it's still a reluctance. There's still a fight that goes on. The legal system is very complicated. It's very slow. We have the kinds of stereotypes and assumptions that we talked about before, that there's consent. So that's a huge issue. We don't see this when we're talking about child sexual abuse, because there are ages in different states, right, where you cannot consent at all. You're not able to form consent. But for adults, 18, let's just say, there's a lot of sense on the part of not only law enforcement, but the law altogether, that people have consented to be there, that there is no evidentiary, despite, as you said, the documentaries, all the things that we see. Look at NXIVM. You mentioned NXIVM. It took a long time. And so there is an enormous process that has to take place to bring this kind of organization to the courthouse door. So if you look at the NXIVM, for example, the district attorney, they do lots of investigations. They spend a long time building a case. And it's just a system that, in my experience, Anthony, it grinds slowly. Martin Luther King said something like the moral arc of the universe is slow, but it bends towards justice. Right. And it does bend that way. And we're seeing it. We see media now, the number of, I'm always grateful, and I include you in this, for podcasts, for journalists, for documentaries that are raising awareness of this issue, right? Because from my perspective, from the law perspective, the ultimate end of the day is 12 people sitting on a jury. And I would love it if those 12 people have listened to your podcast, to the podcasts of other people who are bringing this issue to light, have seen documentaries, because it will make our jobs as lawyers much easier, because they will have some foundation of understanding. So I think absolutely. That all I can say is there are so many points of this that need to be addressed. Consent is one. The justice system just is very slow in relationship to religions, and slow altogether, as you saw from the NXIVM documentary, how long it took before that case was brought to trial.
And I think I'm going to add in there that I think some of that too is that the brainwashing that goes on a lot of times inside of a cult is very hard to prove. It's very hard to prove brainwashing. And that is usually what's happening. It's false consent, but how do you prove that?
Exactly. It's very difficult. There are some concepts that we are not well prepared to be able to litigate in courts. One of them is the issue of consent and brainwashing, as you said. One of the big issues from my perspective is coercion, our understanding of what coercion does to people and how it changes their thinking, right? And so, as you said, it's a false consent. It's not an informed consent. And I know you do podcasts on human trafficking. And if you notice in the human trafficking law, nowhere in there does it say you have to prove that you didn't consent. What it does is it uses coercion and fraud. When you have fraud and coercion, you cannot have consent. And that particular law recognizes that. And that's why it has been, I think, will prove to be, these are early days. And again, the law grinds along quite slowly. But these are early days in using the human trafficking law, the federal law, against cults where there's been sexual abuse.
Yes.
Is it a case of that there are just too many? And like you said, it takes years of investigation. So if a DA is aware of, in a particular city or state, they're aware of an organization that is being accused or allegations of sexual abuse or child sex or forced labor, all of the things that cults, the coercion.
Yes.
Are they just not going after them because they just don't have enough information? Somebody like Judith Castillo who comes forward, she's a wealth of knowledge, and I don't know why they can't, either the federal government, I guess would have to be the federal, take the cult out. I know they're hiding behind religion, but behind those closed doors, we know what's going on.
Mm-hmm. Well, it takes somebody. It takes, for example, on the criminal side, because we have two possible avenues for this. One is on the criminal side, which is what we saw with NXIVM, and the other is on the civil side. And I'm trying to think of a big civil case. Well, Harvey Weinstein is a good example of a civil case. And so we have two avenues. One is brought by the government, that's the criminal side, at the end of which, if a person is found guilty, they go to jail. There's Keith Raniere, 120 years.
Right.
On the civil side, there's no jail. On the civil side, there's only monetary compensation. So I work on the civil side. So when I look at a case, I know, for example, I might know that this, I believe it took place. There's a playbook. They're not all that different. All of them are very, very similar in how they operate.
Exactly.
Right?
We have figured that out for doing this. Yes. Yeah. So many similarities.
Yes.
It is like they all receive a manual in the mail, and they at least go by a similar guideline and use similar tactics to control and manipulate people and brainwash them.
Exactly. And so I see that. I talk to a person and they tell me about what has happened to them, and I know that it's true, but I'm going to have to prove it. Okay. Right. So in order to prove it, I have to have some kind of witnesses. I have to have other people. I have to have some kind of pattern or corroboration. But in addition to that, there are several things. I had some women come forward to me who were members of a cult, and they wanted to bring a civil suit. So the kind of realities of that are that much of what happened outside of the United States. So right away, I have an issue of jurisdiction. Where can I bring this? Where was there enough connection to the United States to be able to bring a claim? Then I have to look at what's the claim. That if I can get under the Human Trafficking Act, that's really a positive thing for me. I can check that off on my, checklist of things that I have to have before I can take a case. And so eventually I have to look at all these things. And at the end, the reality, and this is a very sad reality, but as I said, the civil justice system is about money. So if we cannot find or reach assets, it's not a case that we can take. Right? So that a lot of restrictions on the civil side. Another restriction on the civil side are the statutes of limitations.
Right.
So if I had a wish list, which maybe I actually do, since I'm about to tell you two things that are on my wish list. One is that we would have either no statutes of limitations for sexual assaults, like Canada does,
Yeah.
or we would have longer ones. Because to your point from earlier, Melody, think about it. You called it brainwashing, whatever we call it, the coercion that takes place makes it take a long time for people and survivors to recognize what has happened to them. I see this in my own cases.
100%.
I have clients who were not aware that they were raped for 10 years. So when the statute of limitations is 5, then that's the end.
That's the end.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, there is a delayed discovery argument, but it's very difficult. It's, as you said before, we're trying to persuade people about something that they have no knowledge of. And we're trying to persuade judges, juries, a whole lot of people that simply can't understand. Well, you were present. This happened to you. All of the things that would describe a rape, and you didn't know it.
Right.
But of course.
Exactly. And
well,
then
let me ask you this,
because when you're out of that environment, it takes a while to deconstruct and actually know yourself that you've been a victim. And then now you're trying to prove it to other people. And that creates a lot of complication. Go ahead, Andrew.
It sure does.
Yes. And we had many guests on that were assaulted or sexually abused at the ages of 10, 12. I think Judith was one of them. She might not be a good example. I was brought up in the Roman Catholic Church, and my parents were very big in the Catholic Church, and I worked for the Catholic Church many, many, many years ago. And I'm sure you're familiar with this, is that the Catholic Church settled recently, like, I don't know how much, millions and millions of dollars to the pedophilia that was going on with priests back in the 60s and 70s.
Yes.
So how did that get past the statute of limitations?
Were they criminal case? Well, there could be delayed discovery. So one of the issues is, if you didn't know, as we talked about. But I think these were child cases.
Correct.
So in the world of statutes of limitations, there are often longer statutes of limitations for children than there are for adults. As if, think about how crazy this is, as if when you turn from your 17th to your 18th birthday, you have suddenly gained, enough presence of mind or experience or agency to understand what has happened to you. It doesn't make any sense. And I think that this is why it takes a village. We need people, that we need the psychologists and the researchers who are doing, research into the brain and what happens to our brain in these coercive environments, because then we, the lawyers, are going to use those studies to be able to teach jurors. We need the media, because we need people to be out there talking about this. And so people can hear it and say, oh, wow, I never thought about it that way, because that is going to educate people who will maybe be on our juries. It's going to reach survivors. I can't tell you how many people tell me, I didn't realize what had happened to me until I heard someone else speaking about it. And then I said, oh my God, that happened to me. So we need so much in this area. A long roundabout answer, Andrew, to why. Why? Because they're complicated issues, and because we have to build cases on evidence.
Yes.
And in the civil justice system, if we don't have assets, we can't take the case. Because all of my cases, you can imagine, I'm sure, that survivors who have done forced labor, many of them for many years, have given away the best of their working years to an organization that has abused them, they do not have money to pay for lawyers.
Right.
They are the
Right.
people who need lawyers. And so the cases that we take on a contingency fee, which means we have to win before we make any money for the survivor, and then we take a percentage. So as a business matter, and also because we don't want to put a survivor through the rigors of the litigation process if there isn't going to be anything at the end.
And I would say a really good analogy for those who aren't familiar with cult tactics that people are more familiar with would be a victim of domestic violence who not only have they been potentially coerced and brainwashed, but they're afraid. They're afraid to come forward for years until they feel safe. And there is a lot of similarities between a victim of a cult and a victim of domestic violence that maybe like somebody in our audience might be able to relate to that on a little bit easier than the victim of a cult because they're so unfamiliar with how a cult works and how people are victimized.
Yes.
So I just throw that out there as an analogy, mostly for the audience. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Carol.
Yes, it's a good one. No, it's a good one because look, there's lots of problems in, and we used to say, I hope we don't say it anymore. Why didn't you just leave? So that's the question that people say. Well, if you were being abused, why didn't you just leave? The same question is, the answer is the same when it's asked of cult survivors, because they are there, because they are working there, because after you work for no money for a long time, you don't have any money in order to leave. And because you have a community and because, it's the same thing. And we're seeing, by the way, in a couple of states that laws on domestic violence are including the concept of coercion, which is what we need in cults. So part of what you asked about, Andrew, was why we can't get them. And it's because we don't always have laws that outline what they cannot do. So we do have laws on sexual assault. So thank goodness, because we're able to take action on that. But we don't have laws on psychological abuse. We don't have laws on emotional abuse. We don't have laws on coercion. We don't have laws against, I gave all of my life savings to this cult and then they abused me and I found out that they were charlatans. We don't have laws on that. We need laws that show that people who are coerced cannot make consent, whether it's about giving money to them or agreeing to stay and work for them.
Okay. I have so many questions, and let's go back to La Luz del Mundo, for example. So I'm a member of that religious organization, i.e., cult, and I see that one of my leaders, and they call them apostles, there was arrested for raping or molesting a minor, and I think they were talking 10, 12 years old. I don't remember the ages. As a member of that cult, I would look up at that and say, I don't want to be part of an organization that the leaders are abusing children. So I would leave. I did. I'm not going to say, but exactly. I was a member of the Roman Catholic Church because I was brought up that way. I went to Catholic high school, grammar school, college, yada, yada. And I got married in the Catholic Church. But then when I worked for them around 1990, I did some campaign funding, capital campaign for them through another company. And I firsthand saw the child abuse. I was assigned to something, the Diocese of Camden, not far from you.
Yes,
okay?
Right.
I worked down there, and I saw, not Carol, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. The drugs and alcoholism that I saw in the priesthood, the child, all of it. I just said, I don't want to be part of this. Yes. And I left. I said, I just left. I said, I'm not going to be part. Now, I have my own beliefs and I have my own higher power, yada, yada, but I don't want to be part of an organization that allowed, because the priests were being moved from parish to parish. When they were. This is before all the lawsuits. When there was allegations, they would take the priests and move them from Camden. Let's put them over in Arizona or something like, you know what I'm. But me as a member, I said, I'm not going to be part of this anymore.
Right. And so you would like to understand why, for example, people in La Luz del Mundo are not looking at this and saying, we've got to shut this place down because it's
Correct.
just bad. And I think that it goes back to the same thing that we talked about before, which is fraud and coercion. Many people don't believe that this is. So
Yes.
that's the first thing. So if you think of it again like a domestic situation, you know, your partner says to you, "Well, look at the kinds of things that married people do to one another, you know." And so I'm married. Let's say I say to my partner, "I think you're cheating on me," and my partner says, "Oh my goodness, no, that's not true." In some part in the back of my brain, I may know it's true, but how hard is it for me to come to a realization of that? And so I think for many people, they stay in because it's the continuation of the kind of coercion and fraud. You look up to a community member and that member says to you, well, we do it in our own politics. We say, I'm being persecuted. This isn't true. You know, we accuse politicians of something and they say, no, that isn't true. Believe me, that isn't true.
Right.
And if we are aligned with them, then we do believe.
Exactly. They've invested so much. They've invested everything. And so they almost start gaslighting themselves to some degree.
I think that is absolutely true. So it's very difficult for people to look at it. And I find that people who eventually get out describe a process of getting out. And it also depends, I think, Andrew, in your situation that you described, that you're a member of a church, but you are living out in the community. You're living in your neighborhood among friends and family who may not be Catholic, who may have other religions. You work with people who have other views. When most cults are able to do what they do is when, like Raniere, like many of these cults, people are isolated from their birth communities, although some people, of course, are born into these communities. Very hard for them to understand anything different. But they are isolated in these communities where there's a kind of group think. And we've all experienced that. Yes, exactly. And so I often think that, like, for you could, when you saw something happening among the priests and things that were bad, that you could go home and you could say to your friend or your neighbor over a cup of coffee, wow, this doesn't seem right to me. What do you think? And people are able to bring in different ideas into our head. I think it was kind of aerating, the brain that has been really coerced into thinking only one way, because that's the marker of cults.
Yes.
You can only think one way.
Yes.
Well, I understand the whole concept of coercion and gaslighting, and especially if you were born. I think, Melody, you were when
I
your
was not born.
family joined the House of Yahweh.
I was 15.
15.
Yeah.
Okay. In my example of the Roman Catholic Church, it didn't happen in one city, so it wasn't just in my diocese of where I live. It was happening in, like I said, in Camden and all across the country and the world. As the host of a cult show, and I'm here to advocate for the survivors, I just find it hard for me to understand why you look up at your leader and he's in handcuffs because he raped a 9-year-old. Melody, you had, I think it was your cult, where the leader had an affair with his secretary, was it?
Yes, it was. Yep. That's when he started teaching the multiple marriage, correct?
Yeah, and and then he told everybody, oh, okay, we can have multiple wives now. So he changed
The teaching.
Yes.
To
Yes.
fit his agenda.
It's changing the goalposts, changing the rules, or
And that's
denying it, or a lot of the cults that I have survivors that come from have things like this is part of our religion. This is our religion, that I can have numerous wives, or it is I'm actually celibate, but this is a religious practice that I'm teaching you that is going to teach you non-attachment to your ego. Well, in the same way that it could take a survivor years to figure out what happened to them, it takes people who are inside years to figure out that they've been lied to.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it's to your metaphor of the marriage.
Yes.
It's the same thing.
Absolutely.
And that's why Melody left. All right, Melody.
Yes, and I will say, Andrew,
she was married, and she said,
I was going to say, and the thing is that there was a large number of people that left my cult at that time. So that was the supposed aha moment for a group or a portion or a percentage of the followers were, and almost, I would say the leader used it almost like a test, like, how far can I push these people? And guess what? The people that won't be pushed this far, I don't want them here anyway because I can't control them. So he was okay with a portion of us going because he knew that we were just going to upset the apple cart anyway. So he wanted us to go because we were in his way, and we were going to potentially create critical thinking in other followers, which was detrimental to his agenda.
And you can't have that.
Yes.
Yeah. You can't have that. That is why when people do begin to question within cults, that they are shunned and they are thrown out for exactly that reason, Melody, because you do not want someone in there raising a question.
Right, exactly.
That
you
may
might
cause
create critical thinking in others. You're going to cause others to start critically thinking about, if they're questioning it, maybe I should be questioning it. No, you go away because you're upsetting the apple cart here. Yes, exactly. No, Andrew, it's very similar to gaslighting in a relationship where you almost justify the unjustifiable because you don't know how to. There's this cognitive dissonance that's happening that I can't accept this because it doesn't make sense.
Right.
Yeah. And Melody knows my story, and Carol, my other podcast was about a relationship that I was in that I stayed. She was she was cheating on me, and I chose to ignore it, and I stayed. So I'm kind of being a hypocrite here, calling because I stayed in a relationship for 2 years longer than I should have, knowing what was going on. In my case, it was more of vanity. She was beautiful and yada yada yada. So,
but there are lots of reasons that happens, and it's a very good way of thinking about what happens for survivors. And sometimes it takes 2 years for people to come to the reality, or more, or more.
That was just a relationship. In cult, it took Melody how many years before you put a Christmas tree in your house after you left?
I left, 17.
17?
17 years, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was part of my deconstruction.
Well, it's a great message that we're changing all the time, right? Our brains are capable of changing and creating, as you said, critical thinking. And that happens for cult survivors too. And not on anybody's time frame. It happens when it happens
for everyone. Because some people will leave and they might immediately put a Christmas tree in their house. That was not the case for me.
Okay. Again, and we're not going to have time for all these questions, but we have a list of questions for you. We've been wanting to have a lawyer on for the entire podcast, and it's tough to get someone to come on and speak. And so, again, thank you for doing this. Can you talk to us about maybe some of the, I don't know if you can talk about your current cases, but any cases that you're working with that might, for example, what are some of the challenges victims face when they seeking legal? They come out of the cult and a year later, or they want to take action. How What's the process that a victim can do?
Well, so what usually happens is that people are out. They've, as I said, sometimes they're out because they've seen a documentary, they've heard a podcast, whatever. And when they are thinking about healing, when they're thinking about reconstructing their lives, sometimes for some people, not for everyone, there's a sense that they want to hold the cult accountable for what happened to them, and that this is part of their healing process. So what might happen is someone might reach out to me. We have a website, and I can give you all of that. But they will reach out to me and say, like, I was in this cult and this happened to me. Can you help me? And so then what we do is we schedule a time to talk to the person, because as I mentioned earlier, there are certain things that we have to check off in order. We have to know that we can prove something, right? So
Right.
I can say that in the 6 years that I've been doing this, both as a lawyer and before that doing investigations, I haven't had anybody come to me that I thought, I don't believe that they're telling me the truth. I never think that, for the very same reason that we talked about before, Melody, because it's the same playbook. And,
Yes.
this person that's coming to me hasn't been in 20 different cults. They don't know that. They're
Yeah,
describing
exactly.
something that is extremely familiar. And
Right.
so we are looking for all of the legal check marks. Are you within the statute of limitations? Was it sexual assault? Because sexual assault happens to be the
Yep.
only thing that we can deal with in the law, because just coercion, they made me give them money, they abused me emotionally. There's no law for that, so we can't bring lawsuits. So we're looking at the law, we're looking at jurisdiction, statutes of limitations.
What about physical abuse? Because we've heard many cult survivors talk about when they
Yes.
were caught. There were one episode we had on the two teenagers. I think it was the Amish episode. In the Amish community, the two teenagers were caught talking to each other, and they were forbidden, and they were physically abused. I forget
Yeah.
how, Melody. I don't remember exactly what they did to them, but there was physical punishment.
Yeah.
So physical abuse, yes, but there's usually, again, a short statute of limitations on that.
Right.
Maybe with children it's different, right? But in the for us, where the kind of narrow band that we're in is sexual assaults in cult-like spiritual religious communities. So we're looking for that. We're looking for the coercion, for example. We're looking to check off a lot of legal boxes. And ultimately, we're also looking for assets, because money is one of the few things that a survivor can get in the civil justice system. We can ask, and people often want this, we can ask for non-economic kinds of things. We can ask the organization for an acknowledgement. So I'm working, for example, on a case right now, and not everything goes to trial. In this case, we have lots of cases that go to mediation, where we have a professional mediator, sometimes a retired judge, a lawyer, who's able to bring the two sides together without going through the long grinding process of litigation. When I say bring the two sides together, I don't actually mean that literally, because the sides never come together. The mediator acts as a kind of shuttle diplomat, between the two. So I'm working on one right now where there was for a money demand. So we say, we're asking for this much money because this is the harm that's been done, and the mediator is mediating between the parties on the money demand. At the same time, we are able to ask for things like an acknowledgement. So we can ask for them to say, we have made errors, they will not admit liability. We are lawyers. We would not permit them to, because there may be other people out there, right? So they're not going to do that. So what I find with survivors is we have to be realistic about what we can achieve. We can
I have another question,
achieve
and I think I know the
sometimes.
answer to this. does it make it easier when you have multiple survivors coming forward with very similar allegations? Because I would assume that would make a case much easier to prove if you have multiple people with very similar
Yeah.
stories. So if
Yes,
people can
indeed. It
get some
shows
of
a
their
pattern.
fellow survivors. Yeah, exactly. That's what I was
Yes.
assuming, and that would be easier to prove in
Yeah.
court.
And yes, indeed. And even then, even with one survivor, it is possible to be able to prove it, because you know what? It didn't happen to just one person. Somebody
No.
else knows about it. Somebody else has heard about it. There are ways that we can develop that kind of proof. So people don't have to come in to the law firm with their proof.
Multiples,
We,
right.
we look into it, we build a case, and then sometimes, as I said, we go to mediation. We have cases where people have been abused as children, and that is a different statute of limitations. Also, Andrew, to your reference to the Roman Catholic Church and the difficulty with priests, because of that kind of thing, a lot of states have opened statute of limitation windows. So New York had an open window for children who were abused, no matter how long ago it was.
Good. Okay.
New York had a law with an open window for adults that was open from, I think, November 2022 to November 2023. No matter how long ago it happened. Colorado has had an open window. California, Vermont has abolished the statute of limitations on child sexual abuse. So we see that there's movement, right?
In the right direction.
Yes.
Yeah, we're moving in that direction, but we have so far to go.
Oh, yeah. We have 4 pages of questions here. We're never going to get to them.
No.
Is there?
We knew that.
Is there a? Yeah. I would almost say we might need to do a part 2, but just getting this interview together was challenging.
Yes.
Is there any case that you've worked on in the past that was very unique or outstanding that you can share with us? And what kinds of evidence were typically used to gather the evidence? Like, how did you get the evidence? Did you win the case? Anything memorable that?
Well, so first of all, very few of these cases actually go to trial. So the thing that we think about the justice system, right, is that, we see on television, I used to joke that everything I knew about, trials, I learned from Law and Order, right? Because they had a trial every week. And we down here in the trenches of law don't have a trial every week. And so I would say that we do a lot of investigation in cases where we're trying to develop a case. As Melody said, if we have three plaintiffs that have the similar story, then we've got a pattern that's a pretty good evidence. But we use an investigator who actually, digs up people and talks to people from long ago, and we build a case. So we're building a case right now. I think this is a kind of interesting one. So see what you think. We're building a case right now where it's under the New York open window. It's an old case from the 70s and 80s. And this particular organization, there was a certain amount of media about difficulties with sex and children and that kind of thing, even early on, but nothing happened. To your point, Andrew, nothing happened. And then in the 90s, there was another article in another magazine about, things that might have gone on. And over the years, there were people who left the organization, who tried to get the organization to hold itself to account because the leader was now dead. So we're talking a long time ago, right? So here we have media, fabulous for us, because we are able to see what people said in 1980 something, and we are able to track those people down, and we're able to talk with them. We have a support group of ex-members who are supporting the women who came forward. which is tremendously important. And they are people who were in the cult and they know things. And so if I need to know something, I know people I can talk to who can tell me who I should talk to. Do you see what I mean?
Yes.
It's about building a case. And if you build a case, it makes it so much easier to do it because we have all of this. When you build a case like that, you often don't go to trial because on the other side, where there are also lawyers who do this for a living, they look at it and they say, oh, wow, this looks like a case that we ought to settle.
Because they know they're not going to win.
Yeah.
And so I think there, I've mentioned academics, I've mentioned, brains, researchers, media. I would also say that ex-survivors, ex-cult members, it really takes a lot of support. It takes a lot of courage for people to stand up and say, I'm going to be involved in holding this organization to account. And having a group of survivors that supports those people, very important. It happened in Buddhist Project Sunshine. It happened in another case that I worked on in Canada, Project Satya. These were all survivors who themselves put together a support group for some of the plaintiffs so that they would have support during this process. That is so, it takes a community, it takes a village, and that's what we need.
You mentioned earlier that not always there's a monetary settlement. Well, and I may have misheard you. Could you ever get a cult or an organization to admit publicly what they did? So,
I've never, here's what I would say. In some situations where the person who did the abuse is dead, let's say, they're not going to be sued.
Right.
The organization didn't know. See, nobody is going to admit liability. That's just a reality. If there is, I used to be a management defense lawyer. I would not advise my client to admit, we did something that we could be held liable for in the future. They don't have to do that, and they're not going to do it. If what they're acknowledging sometimes is that we did things wrong, we could have done it better.
Yeah.
Right. We should have known. We didn't know, things that you might not be held liable for. But it helps for survivors to be realistic about what we can actually get. Some of my survivors want, as you do, perhaps, as I do, to bring these cults down.
Right.
And we're not always able to do it. It's like chipping at, a brick wall with a chisel, one, like little chink at a time.
Yes. Well, and you're adding to that. You're helping with that. We're helping with that. I think the awareness, like you said, is key, because once people become more aware, they're going to, if they end up on a jury, they're going to see these tactics were used. They're going to be aware that this was done under coercion or manipulation or brainwashing, whatever you want to call it. And then these people are going to be more likely to be held accountable, because people are aware that these things are going on under the surface. It's not just what you see on the surface. It's what's going on underneath. And that is what we need, is that awareness and that knowledge, and making the public have that ability to see it for what it really is. And that's a difficult thing when you haven't been in that situation, to see it from that perspective.
Exactly. And hopefully we're helping raise the awareness so that people don't get involved in these organizations, right? So that some kind of red flag goes up and says, wait a minute, this sounds, I had a woman come to me who said that she watched, she was in a cult along with her sister, and somehow or another they were allowed to go and visit somebody, and they were watching the Keith Raniere documentary on television, and she said they looked at each other and they said, oh my God, we're in a cult.
Oh,
just like that. Yeah, we're in a cult. And so the more people that we educate, the more people that we may not only get out of a cult, but people who won't get into it. They'll say, well, wait a minute, that just doesn't feel right to me.
Absolutely.
It requires education.
And to your point of that they watched the documentary, we have interviewed many cult survivors who have said, and this was going back to 20 years ago when we didn't have social media, we didn't have streaming devices, or they
Podcast.
were just in the cult. They were not allowed podcast. They were not allowed to have a cell phone, a
Right.
laptop, or so that back then they couldn't have watched Nexium documentary. I think
Exactly.
with today's technology,
Yes.
even in the Amish, Jehovah's Witnesses and the Amish, and where you're still not allowed to do or have a cell phone. Some of them you can't even have a radio. I think what's happening is you're going to see, hopefully, the younger
Yes.
generation come up and avoid joining these. Yeah,
Yes.
Yes.
That's the
I would
hope.
hope by the end of this century, I would hope that cults are no more. I think that's a wild. That
It's
sounds
an
like
ambitious agenda, Andrew.
yeah,
But
yeah,
Yes.
but you know what? As I said before, the moral arc of the universe bends slowly, but it bends toward justice. And so it's always about what we have the opportunity to do today, like sitting together, the three
Yes.
of us, and talking about this. It's every step amounts to something in the long term bending toward justice. It does. I really believe that.
yeah. You know, as I just made that statement about, I hope by the end of this century, I just realized the Twin Flames universe just popped up a couple of years ago. So, and he and his wife are young, in their late 20s or something,
And I think
so they're
that's
going after their own.
yes, I was going to say that's a good
Yeah.
example of a cult actually using technology to their advantage and figuring out a way to use
Yes.
that as almost
their
a form of
advantage.
manipulation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And the TikTok dancers, there's a
Yeah.
there's
Oh
a
yes.
there's a
Yeah.
lot of and the Ranieri thing, which was the multi-level marketing. I think we live in a complicated world where people are looking for black and white answers.
Yes.
There's a lot of ambiguity, uncertainty, those kinds of things for people of every age range. And I think those are times in which people seek out somebody who says, I know the answer. There's only one answer.
Right.
Yep.
And I know it. And you stick with me, and I'm going to teach it to you. Even I, who have never been in a cult, have no desire to be, certainly not, something that I'm going to do, but I feel that. I feel how comforting that message can be to people.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm in AA, and I've also been in a mood disorder support group. I've run groups. So being part of a community, it's I
Yeah.
get it.
So there's an amount
absolutely.
of comfort that comes with that. Yeah.
Carol, unfortunately, we're going to have to start to wrap it up, but I want to ask you if we can leave a window open maybe for you to come back
I would
someday.
love to come back. Of course, I would love to come back.
So in closing, what would you advise? So somebody is watching, listening to this, or they know somebody that's in a cult, or they just got out of a cult. How do they begin the process of not only healing, which I don't know if you could truly answer that, but how would they go through getting a lawyer? I know you have your organization,
Yep.
but what would be their first step?
I think really the first step, and I say this for people who are the friends and family of people who are coming out of a cult, is to really be there for that person. No judgment, no expectation, just recognizing that this is a very difficult experience. Once the person is out, people have to rebuild their lives in different ways. I always recommend support groups. I recommend therapy, because people come out with shame, largely because as a society, we don't understand why people have been in cults to begin with. And so they feel ashamed. People who have been sexually assaulted and realize that they've been assaulted and that this wasn't a teaching or a way to enlightenment, they feel shame, and they need that, kind of trusted psychologist, therapist to work with. And
Right.
and then I think that people who come out of cults need to think, what is my healing journey now? It doesn't have to define us that something
No.
happened like this. It's about
No.
how we're going to work with that information, with that experience, and embark on a healing journey. And for some people, it's litigation. I have a woman who not been able to proceed with her case, probably because of the courts have not accepted it, but who said, I won. I won just getting the cult leader to the door of the courthouse. I won.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so when you understand that there are no easy answers to this, there are no really slam dunk solutions, but that it's a journey, I think it helps people. People tell me that it's a healing process for them.
For sure. Well, Carol, we want to thank you
Amazing.
so much for coming on the show and helping us to shine a light on the shadows of these people hiding in the shadows and trying to get away with some of this stuff. And you're one of the advocates standing up for fellow survivors and helping to shine that light and say, no, we aren't going to tolerate this. And you've given us hope that the legal system is moving in the right direction. And that is, it means the world. It means the world to us. And I know it means the world to especially fellow survivors listening to the show.
And I thank you for what you are doing as well. We are all in the same battle together. It's wonderful to have allies.
Carol, thank you so much for speaking with us, and we look forward to speaking with you again.
We want to thank Carol once again for coming on the show. And I'm on behalf of cult survivors in general, I want to thank not only Carol, but also the McAllister and Oliveras law firm for everything that they do for fellow survivors. It is so greatly appreciated. And I'm always so grateful when people like you and Carol are advocates for survivors not having lived through a cult experience yourself. I think it's just a testament to humanity reaching out to each other and helping people and in a way that something they've never experienced or been through. Usually you have to go through that trauma to really understand and have that kind of empathy for people. But I love that. I love that. And it really, for me personally, it touches my heart. And I love that there's somebody out there doing that, standing up for the people who can't always and don't always know how to stand up for themselves.
Oh, yes. And it's interesting to the audience. They don't know this yet, but last night we interviewed somebody named the Cult Hunter, and he's a journalist, right? And he's almost 40, and this was not something he started out in his career chasing cults and reporting on them. He's a real journalist and a real investigator, and he does cult investigations, but he never dreamed that this would be what he'd end up doing. Right. I could say the same thing. I'm an IT guy, and here I am at 64 years old, and I'm producing podcasts about cults. And I found something really, really wrong with it. Of course, the story everybody knows Twin Flames is what kicked me off. But then I started, and then I met you, and so it's become a passion because I just see something. And we talked about this a little bit about me being in the Catholic Church. It's not a cult, but there are very many similarities. The way I was brought up and beat by the nuns, and so it's not a cult. I'm not comparing it. It's just, but I could see or feel the passion and for what you and all the cult survivors have gone through, and it breaks my heart that people go through, and human trafficking, of course.
And I love that you help provide this platform for survivors to come on, because for a lot of us, telling our stories is part of our healing journey. That is part of it, because we spent so many years with being basically having, somebody putting a hand over our mouth and telling us what we can and can't say and what we can and can't share. And once you get to that point where you break free from that part of the brainwashing and the control, that's the one thing you want to do, is speak out against these places and these controlling people and say, hey, this is what happened to me. This is the truth about this place. And it's very empowering to be able to do that. So,
and that's why I started podcasting, was that I went through a traumatic relationship that ended horribly. And what I went through in that relationship traumatized me severely, that I even had to go EMDR therapy. And they could talk about you coming on here talking about it's a healing process. The podcast was just for me to vent and just say, hey guys, this is what happened to me. I hope it doesn't happen to you. Look for these signs, look for these red flags. And it morphed into something beyond my wildest dreams. And now I have 2 podcasts. And I
think that's how you can relate.
My partner now.
Yeah, and I think that's how you relate to the cult survivors. And certainly, just like we talked about in this episode with Carol, about how there are so many similarities between like domestic violence victims and then people who go through that same type of gaslighting, manipulation, coercion in a cult situation. There are so many similarities. So, I think that's where you got your empathy for cult victims, is because, and I think you started with the twin flames specifically because you could see how somebody in a situation similar to yours could end up getting sucked in by a cult like that, that's promising to find your true love.
At the end of that relationship, I stumbled upon TFU because I was Googling heartbreak and how to heal and looking, and that's how I've been always a podcast. Thank God they don't have a podcast. TFU. Can you imagine if they launched a podcast? Oh
gosh, don't make any suggestions.
Yeah, but if I had stumbled upon them, I don't know, the place my mind was in, I might have said, "Oh, what's this? Let me take a look," and I might have maybe joined it. Who knows? Whatever. Let's go back to Carol. What I found really interesting, that who would have thunk that there are actual lawyers who represent cult victims. So that's her specialty now. And I'm sure there's others, but I don't think, and I think Carol said this herself, she didn't go to law school thinking she was going to help cult survivors, but here she is working very hard.
And the other thing is she gave us hope that the judicial system is at least moving in the right direction to try to change the laws about the coercion and the consent and what that actually means, and whether these people are consenting under duress, all of those things, which, we know the judicial system works in baby steps and small steps, but it's good to hear that it's moving in the right direction. It's very reassuring.
Yeah, we need more. We need more oversight. The government wants to get involved in places in our lives as I think they have no business. But there are times when this is one of them where I think they need to get more involved. And I've ranted about this with you and other guests, that the government isn't doing enough. But Carol explained that it's very hard to prove.
Yes.
I listened to a scam podcast this morning about scamming, and the banks are putting the blame on the victims. You gave them your six-digit code that they texted you. Well, because I thought it was your bank, and and so their deniability, and it's horrible. It's just horrible.
It is.
Carol, thank you so much for coming on and explaining all of this to her, and hopefully she'll be back. We'll have her on again.
Yes, and we want to thank all of you as well for tuning into Cultimatum. Your support, as always, is greatly appreciated. We would appreciate it if you would take a moment to review our podcast on platforms such as Apple and Spotify. And don't forget to follow, share, and keep listening to all of our latest episodes.
You can also show your support by joining our Facebook group under the name Cultimatum Podcast.
And you can find us on social media platforms, including Instagram, Pinterest, TikTok, YouTube, and Threads.
If you have a cult or human trafficking experience that you would like to share with us, please feel free to contact us at cultimatumpodcast@gmail.com.
And if there are any ex-cult members out there looking for any additional support, you can consider joining the Cult Escape and Recovery group on Facebook.
And if you're interested in hearing more from me and like my rants or want to listen to dating advice and relationship advice, you can find me on my other podcast, Anonymous Andrew, Life and the Choices We Make.
And if you want to hear my rant on Lyme disease, I did that. I did a rant on Andrew's podcast last weekend. So if you want to hear my weekend rant, you can listen to last weekend's episode. And as always, stay safe, stay informed, and remember, you're not alone.